He burned every letter she ever wrote him. That was what Evelyn's uncle told her, the summer she turned 22, standing in the kitchen with his arms crossed and his voice as flat as a slab of stone. Rowan Hale doesn't want you. He threw them in the fire. All of them. She remembered the way her legs had stopped working, the way she'd grabbed the edge of the counter just to stay upright. She had written 14 letters. 14. And this man who was supposed to protect her, had looked her in the eyes and told her the person she loved most had burned every single one. She believed him. She had no reason not to. And that single lie, spoken by a man who would die years later with his secrets intact, stole 12 years from two people who had done nothing wrong. If you have ever trusted someone who was quietly destroying you, this story is for you. Before we go any further, if stories like this speak to something in your chest, something you recognize, please take a moment to subscribe to this channel, hit that like button, and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels, because some stories deserve to go everywhere. Now, let's go back to where it all began to fall apart, and somehow, impossibly, come back together. The drought had been going on so long that Evelyn Mercer had stopped checking the sky. There was no point. The sky over the northern Montana flats in the summer of 1889 was the same brutal, cloudless white it had been for 9 weeks. The grass that hadn't turned brown had given up and died flat against the cracked earth. The creek that used to run deep enough to cool her ankles had narrowed to a muddy trickle that smelled like something rotting. And the well her late husband Gerald had dug by hand the first year of their marriage, was pulling up about half of what it used to, and even that half looked wrong. Evelyn knew what the numbers meant. She wasn't naive. She had been running this place by herself for 2 years, ever since Gerald's heart gave out in the middle of a January morning. He'd been mending a fence post. One minute he was there, the next he wasn't. She'd found him face down in the snow, and the terrible thing, the thing she still couldn't say out loud to anyone, was that her first emotion wasn't grief. It was a cold, practical dread. Who was going to fix the water pump? She'd felt guilty about that for months. She still did, a little, but guilt didn't fix water pumps. So she'd learned to do it herself. She'd learned to do a lot of things herself. What she hadn't figured out was how to hold off the bank. The loan on the Mercer property, Gerald's loan, taken out 3 years before his death to expand the herd, was coming due in October. And between the drought cutting her hay crop in half, the loss of 4 cattle to some kind of fever in the spring, and the cost of the repairs she'd put off until she simply couldn't anymore, the number she needed and the number she had were separated by a gap that made her feel sick when she thought about it too directly. She didn't think about it too directly very often. She thought about it sideways, the way you think about something that frightens you, in quick glances, then looking away. That particular evening, the one that changed everything, she was out behind the barn trying to fix a section of fence that had been leaning at a 40-degree angle for 3 days. She had the post hole digger, she had the new post, she had sweat running into her eyes and a blister forming on her right palm, and she was losing the argument with the ground because the ground was like concrete, and she was 40 years old and tired in a way that sleep didn't fix anymore. She heard the gate at the end of the long drive creak open. She didn't look up. Probably the Hendersons from down the road, coming to borrow the fence stretcher again. She straightened up, pressed one hand against the small of her back, and turned around. And every thought she had in her head simply stopped. The man standing at her gate was thinner than she remembered. Older, clearly, though she supposed they both were. He had the same dark hair, but there was gray at the temples now, and his face had lines that hadn't been there before. Not the soft kind that came from laughing, but the kind that came from years of weather and hard decisions. He was holding something against his chest with both arms, the way you carry something fragile and irreplaceable. The something was a little boy, fast asleep. Head on the man's shoulder, one small fist wrapped around the collar of his father's shirt. Evelyn stood there with the post-hole digger in her hand and her mouth completely dry. Rowan Hale said, "Evelyn." Just that. One word. Her name. Like he wasn't sure she was real, or like he wasn't sure he had the right to say it. She said nothing for what felt like a very long time. The boy stirred slightly in Rowan's arms, made a small sound, and then went back to sleep with absolute confidence, the way only very young children and people who have never been truly frightened can sleep. Evelyn noticed that Rowan's arms tightened around him automatically, without thinking. that protective reflex. She noticed it and wished she hadn't, because noticing it made something happen in her chest that she did not have room for. "You need to tell me what you want," she finally said. Her voice came out harder than she intended. "Good." Rowan's jaw moved. He was choosing words carefully. She could see it. "I know I don't have the right to be here." "No, you don't. I've got nowhere else to go." She stared at him. At the road behind him, which was empty. No horse, no wagon. He'd walked. She looked at his boots and confirmed it. They were destroyed. The sole on the left one was separating from the upper, held together by what looked like a piece of wire. "Whose boy is that?" she asked, even though she already had a feeling. "Mine." He shifted the child slightly. "His name is Finn. He's 2. His mother—" "She passed last winter." Evelyn looked at Finn, at his small face pressed against his father's shoulder, at the dark circles under Rowan's eyes that said he hadn't slept properly in a long time, at the wire holding his boot together. She looked at the fence post she still needed to put in the ground. She looked at the sky, which was still white and still dry. She said, "Come inside." The windmill needed a new vein. It had been making a grinding sound for a month, and she could hear it now, that rhythmic complaint against the silence. "What are you saying?" she asked. "I'm saying somebody made sure we didn't." She stood very still. "Rowan, by the time I got back, it was almost 2 years, Ev. My father took a long time dying. When I came back, your uncle told me." He stopped. His jaw tightened. She watched him choose whether to say the next thing and then say it. "He told me you'd married Gerald Mercer, that you'd moved on, that you were happy." She heard the words, and she felt them hit her somewhere that wasn't exactly her chest and wasn't exactly her stomach. "He said you'd made your choice," Rowan said, "that you didn't want me coming around making things complicated." She sat down. She hadn't meant to. Her legs simply made the decision. She sat down across the table from him and stared at the grain of the wood. Her uncle, Walter Crane, who had sat in this very kitchen, actually, at Gerald and Evelyn's wedding supper, and given a toast about family and new beginnings, who had died 4 years ago in his sleep, who had taken everything he knew with him, so she couldn't look at him and ask him why. She couldn't make him explain what possible logic, what ugly, twisted logic, had led him to destroy something that didn't belong to him. She pressed her palm flat against the table. The blister from the fence post stung. "He told me you burned my letters," she said quietly. "He said you didn't want me." Rowan made a sound, not quite a word, something that came out of him involuntarily, like something had struck him. "Ev, don't." She shook her head. "Just give me a minute." He gave her the minute. That was one thing she'd always been able to say about Rowan Hale. He knew when silence was the right thing. Unlike Gerald, who had filled every quiet space with nervous talk. Gerald had been a good man, a steady man. Not the man she had chosen first, but a decent man who had treated her fairly and built her a solid kitchen and died in the snow trying to fix a fence post. She had mourned him properly. She owed him that much. But there was no point pretending that the 12 years between Rowan leaving and Gerald's death had been the life she would have chosen if someone hadn't stolen the choice from her. She looked up from the table. "What happened to Finn's mother?" Rowan's expression changed again. A different kind of pain this time. "Her name was Clara. I met her up in Havre, 79 or 80. She was a good woman. She deserved better than what she got." He said it plainly, without drama, and she believed him. "She got sick in November. By March, she was gone. Finn doesn't... He's too young to really understand." He glanced toward the settee where the boy was still sleeping. "He just knows she's not there." "And you've been traveling since?" "We've been trying to find somewhere to land." His voice had something exhausted in it, something stripped down. "I had some money saved. That ran out faster than I expected. We spent 3 weeks in Missoula. Couldn't get work. Tried 2 other towns. Nobody wants a single man with a 2-year-old. You can't work a full day. You can't bunk in with the other ranch hands. You're not useful in the ways they need." He paused. "I kept thinking about somewhere I could maybe be useful, somewhere I knew." She understood what he wasn't saying. He'd come here because he was out of options, and because this was the only place after everything that still felt like it had once belonged to him in some way. That was either the most honest thing anyone had ever said to her, or it was the saddest, and she wasn't sure there was much difference. She got up and went to the stove. She had some beans from supper still warm, and she made him a plate without asking whether he was hungry, because obviously he was hungry. She could see it in the way he held himself. She put the plate in front of him and sat back down. He ate. He tried to eat slowly and with some dignity, and he almost managed it. She watched the boy sleep. Finn had dark hair like his father. His cheeks still had that soft roundness that very young children have, like they haven't fully arrived in the world yet, like the world hasn't had time to shape them. He had one arm wrapped around something. She couldn't see what it was, just a small dark object tucked against his chest. She thought about her house, about the list of things broken on this property, about the bank loan due in October, about the fence post still leaning in the yard, and the well going dry, and the grinding windmill, and the 40 years of tiredness that sleep didn't touch. She thought about 12 years, about 14 letters that never arrived, about a man who had walked here on a boot held together by wire because he was out of places to go. She looked at Rowan and said, "I'm not offering you charity." He stopped eating. "I can't afford charity," she said. "I can barely afford to keep this place alive through October. If the bank calls that loan and I can't meet it, I lose everything Gerald left me, and I lose everything I've spent 2 years holding together by myself." She held his gaze. "But if someone could fix the water pump, and replace that windmill vane, and rehang the barn door that's been dragging since February, and put that fence post in before the whole north section collapses." She paused. "That someone might be worth feeding." Rowan was very still. "You can sleep in the barn," she said. "I'll put down a proper mattress. It's clean enough. Finn can sleep inside. There's a room off the kitchen that I use for storage, but I can clear it out." "Evelyn, I'm not finished." She leaned forward very slightly. "I'm not doing this because I've forgiven you. I don't know if I've forgiven you. I don't even know what there is to forgive yet, or who it should be aimed at, but I'm doing it because that child needs a roof over his head, and this ranch needs hands I don't have, and we are both practical people who are in a very difficult situation, and I would rather make a sensible arrangement than stand on principle while everything falls apart around me." Rowan looked at her for a long moment. Then he said quietly, "You always were the most sensible person I ever knew." "Don't make that sound like a compliment," she said. "It isn't meant as one." But there was something in her voice, the faintest fracture in the flatness, and from the way he looked at her, she thought maybe he heard it. She stood up. She started clearing the table. "There's one more thing," she said, not looking at him. "Finn, if he's going to be here, and if he's going to follow me around the way. Very small children follow people around, which I fully expect he will. I need him to know that this is a working home, not a temporary one. I won't have him thinking something is permanent and then have it ripped away from him." She set a pan in the basin a little harder than she intended. "He's already lost enough." Rowan said, "So have you." She didn't answer that. She went to the window instead and looked out at the yard, at the leaning fence post, at the windmill turning slowly in the dry wind, grinding and complaining, at the last orange light dying on the horizon. "I'll show you the barn," she said, "and then we'll figure out what this is." She didn't say, "Hey, I was 22 the last time I saw you, and I had decided by 23 that I would never forgive you. And I kept that promise for 12 years, and I need you to understand that nothing you've said tonight changes that." She didn't say it because it was completely true, and also because something much smaller and much more honest was sitting right beside it, something she hadn't felt in a very long time, something that felt, uncomfortably, like relief. She picked up the lamp. In the other room, Finn slept on, one small fist still clutched around whatever it was he'd carried all this way, whatever small and private thing this little boy had held on to when everything else was taken from him. And outside, the windmill turned, and the night came on, and the Montana sky filled with stars that didn't care about any of it. But Evelyn cared. She was starting, against every reasonable instinct she possessed, to remember what that felt like. Finn woke up the next morning before anyone else. Evelyn heard him first, a small sound from the storage room, not crying exactly, more like the sound a person makes when they surface from sleep into a place they don't recognize and haven't yet decided whether to be afraid. She was already up, already dressed, already had the stove going, because she had slept badly and given up on it sometime around 4 in the morning. She set down the coffee and went to the door of the small room she'd cleared out the night before, swept it out, moved the crates of old seed catalogs and Gerald's spare tack into the corner, put down the extra mattress and the second quilt, and pushed it open a few inches. Finn was sitting up in the middle of the mattress. His dark hair was flattened on one side from sleep. He was looking at her with those eyes, very dark, very steady, very much like his father's. And in his lap he was holding the thing he'd been clutching the night before. She could see it clearly now in the morning light. A small tin horse. The paint was mostly worn off. One of the legs had been bent and straightened so many times it was starting to crack. It was clearly the most important object in his world. He looked at her. She looked at him. "Good morning," she said. He didn't say anything. He pulled the tin horse a little closer to his chest. "That's fair," Evelyn said. "You don't know me yet." She left the door open and went back to the stove. She had made biscuits, not because she was trying to win over a 2-year-old, she told herself, but because she'd been planning to make biscuits anyway. She had the skillet out and the salt pork cut when she heard small feet on the floorboards. She didn't turn around. She just slid one of the lower kitchen chairs out from the table with her foot and kept working at the stove. A long pause. Then the chair scraped slightly, and there was the shifting sound of a small body climbing up, and when she finally turned around with the plate, Finn was sitting at the table with the tin horse in his lap, watching her with that same considering expression. She set a biscuit in front of him. He looked at it. "You can hold the horse while you eat," she said. "I won't take it." He picked up the biscuit. Rowan came in from the barn about 20 minutes later, and when he saw his son sitting at Evelyn's kitchen table, eating a second biscuit with both hands and allowing Evelyn to sit across from him without apparent alarm, something happened to his face that he couldn't quite control. He covered it by going to the basin and washing his hands, taking longer than necessary. "He eat all right?" Rowan asked, his back still turned. "He ate 3 biscuits," Evelyn said. "He doesn't talk much." "He talks," Rowan said. "He just decides first." She looked at the back of Rowan's head, at the gray in his hair. She looked away. "Pump's out back. I'll show you what's wrong with it after breakfast." "I already looked at it this morning." She paused. "You were up before dawn?" He turned around and there was something in his expression that was almost apologetic. "Old habit. I didn't want to. I thought I should have a look around before I started making a list of what needs doing, so I wasn't wasting your time." He sat down across from Finn and touched the boy's hair briefly, automatically, the way parents do when they pass close to their children. "The pump's got a cracked leather seal. I can fix it today if you have the materials. The windmill vane is worse than a bad vane. The whole bracket's rusted through. That's a 2-day job, maybe 3. What else?" He looked at her steadily. "You want the whole list or the list you can afford to hear right now?" She pressed her lips together. "The whole list." He gave it to her. It took a while. She sat and listened with her hands flat on the table and her face as even as she could keep it, and when he was done, she looked at the ceiling for a moment and then back at him. "Okay," she said. "Okay?" I said okay. "We start with the pump and the windmill." He nodded. Then he looked at Finn. "You gonna stay near the house today, bud?" Finn had been listening to all of this with apparent interest, his dark eyes moving between the 2 adults. Now he picked up the tin horse and held it out toward Evelyn. She took it carefully, turned it over in her hands. The metal was warm from his grip. "Thank you," she said seriously. He held out his hand for it back. She returned it. He tucked it back in his lap and returned to his biscuit with the air of someone who had conducted an important transaction. Rowan watched this exchange and said nothing. But his jaw had that tightness again, the kind that meant something was happening behind his eyes that he wasn't going to put words to. The morning passed in the way that working mornings do, too fast and too loud and full of small problems that required immediate solving. Rowan pulled the pump apart with Gerald's old tools, which he found in the barn exactly where Evelyn told him they'd be, and she spent the first hour watching from a distance that she told herself was professional rather than anything else. He worked quickly and without wasted motion. He'd learned things in 12 years. That was obvious. His hands knew what they were doing in a way that young Rowan's hands hadn't always. Young Rowan had been brave and fast and careless, the kind of person who would charge into something and figure it out as he went. This man measured twice and moved once. She found that harder to dismiss than she wanted to. Finn spent most of the morning following her. She hadn't expected that. She thought he'd stay near his father, and at first he did, sitting in the dirt near the pump with his tin horse, watching Rowan work. But somewhere around mid-morning, he appeared at Evelyn's elbow while she was working in the kitchen garden. The garden that wasn't doing well, nothing was doing well, the drought had seen to that, and simply stood there. "I'm pulling weeds," she told him. "It's not exciting." He sat down in the dirt next to the row of struggling carrots and watched her. "You could help," she said. "The ones with the thin leaves aren't carrots. Pull those." He looked at the weeds. He looked at her. He pulled one, very carefully, and held it up for inspection. "That's right," she said. He pulled another one. They worked like that for almost an hour. She talked while they worked, not at him particularly, just narrating the way she did when she worked alone, because silence in an empty place could become a weight if you let it. She told him about the carrots and why they needed more rain. She told him that the garden used to be bigger when there were two of them to keep it. She told him that the cat who had lived in the barn for 6 years had walked off one morning in April and not come back, and that she had looked for it for a week and eventually decided the cat had simply made a choice, and that was the cat's right, though she missed it. Finn listened to all of this. He pulled weeds with increasing confidence. At one point she looked over and he had the tin horse standing in the dirt between the carrot rows, making small sounds with his mouth. Quiet engine sounds, she supposed, or maybe horse sounds, moving it in slow arcs through the dust. She turned back to her weeding and did not examine whatever was happening in her chest. That afternoon, while Rowan was up on the windmill making the kind of sounds that meant progress was slow and painful, Evelyn did her accounting at the kitchen table. She had a system, Gerald's system, actually, which she had adapted and maintained with a discipline born of genuine fear. She knew, to the dollar, what the ranch owed and what it had, and she checked those numbers the way some people check wounds, looking for signs that things were getting worse. They were always getting worse. She did the math again, the October math. She was short. She was going to be short unless the hay came in, and the hay wasn't coming in unless it rained, and there wasn't any sign of rain. She had sold 3 head of cattle in July to cover what she could. She could sell more, but every cow sold was future income gone, and you could only do that so many times before you'd eaten the seed corn. She was sitting with all of this in her head when Rowan climbed down from the windmill. She could hear him on the ladder from the window, and came inside for water. He stood at the basin and drank a full cup, then filled it again. He looked at the account book on the table. "How bad?" he asked. She considered telling him it was fine. She wasn't sure why she didn't. Maybe because it was obvious it wasn't fine, or maybe because she was tired of maintaining that particular performance. "October's the problem," she said. "If I can get through October, the next quarter is manageable. But between now and October—" She stopped, closed the book. "We need that hay to survive, and we need rain to get the hay. And if it doesn't rain, then I sell the north pasture, which means I can't run as many head next spring, which means the year after that becomes the problem." Rowan was quiet for a moment. "What does the note on the north pasture go for?" She told him. He was quiet longer this time. She watched him thinking. She'd always been able to see when he was really thinking, something in the way he went still. He wasn't like most men who put on a show of having it figured out. He would just stop and be honest about the thinking process. "There's a timber company," he said finally, "out of Great Falls. They've been scouting land up through this valley for the last 2 years, looking for access routes. I saw their man in Billings. If you've got a section with good slope down to the river—" "I won't sell access to the timber people," Evelyn said immediately. "Not sell, lease." He looked at her. 6 months, their supply route only. You get paid up front. They don't touch your grazing land." She stared at him. "And you know this because I spent 4 months last year working survey for a timber outfit up in the Bitterroots. I know how they operate. They need access, not land. Most landowners don't know there's a difference." She sat with that. The idea of it. A lease. Cash up front. She looked at the closed account book. "I would need to know the terms," she said carefully. "I know who to write to in Great Falls." "Then write them." He nodded. He turned to go back outside and then stopped in the doorway. "Ev." "What?" He didn't turn around right away. "I was looking at the door frame, at the worn wood. I know what you said last night, about not forgiving me, about this being an arrangement. Rowan, I'm not arguing with it. I just want to say one thing." Now he did turn, and his face was doing that open thing that she'd forgotten. That raw, honest thing that had unnerved her when she was 22 and unnerved her more now. I'm not here trying to take something back that I lost 12 years ago. I know that's not something you can take back. I want you to know that I know that. She held his gaze for a moment that stretched longer than she intended. Go fix the windmill, she said. He went. She sat alone at this table for a full minute before she opened the account book again. The second week was harder in some ways and easier in others. It was harder because the work was relentless and the heat hadn't broken, and because Evelyn kept catching herself noticing things she didn't want to notice. The way Rowan talked to Finn in the evenings, sitting on the barn step in the last light, patient and low, the same voice he'd use with a nervous horse. The way Finn had started following Evelyn into the garden in the mornings without being invited, dragging his tin horse behind him. The way the ranch, which had been so loud with silence for 2 years, had become loud with actual noise, the sound of a hammer, of a child's voice, of someone else's boots on her floorboards. It was easier because the pump was fixed and the water was running clean, and the windmill stopped grinding and started turning the way it was supposed to, and Rowan had rehung the barn door in one afternoon, and it moved on its hinges like it had never given her trouble at all. She didn't say thank you. She said, the north fence still needs restringing, and he said, I know, I'm starting on it tomorrow. And that was how they talked to each other, in tasks, in the language of what needed doing, because it was safer than the other language, the one that kept pushing up underneath. The letter to Great Falls went out on a Tuesday. On Thursday, Evelyn came in from the East Field to find Finn sitting on the kitchen floor with her mother's old button box tipped out in front of him, buttons in every color spread across the floorboards. He had them arranged in some kind of order that made sense to him, the tin horse presiding over the arrangement from the center. She should have said something sharp. That box was not a toy. Those buttons had been her mother's. She stood in the doorway and watched him for a moment. He had a red button he was comparing to a brown one, holding them both up to the light from the window with the absolute seriousness of a geologist assessing samples. The red one, she said. He looked at her. He put the red button down in its place. She went to the stove. That evening she asked Rowan, as casually as she could manage, whether Finn had been allowed to play much, whether there had been, in whatever sequence of temporary rooms and borrowed floors their year had comprised, toys or other children, or any of the ordinary architecture of a childhood. Rowan took his time answering. There was a family in Missoula, he said. They let us stay 3 weeks. They had a girl about 4. Finn liked her. A pause. That was the last time he really played, I think. How long ago? 2 months. She looked at her coffee. I have some things in the storage room still. Some of Gerald's nephew's things from when he visited. He was about 4 or 5 years ago. A carved horse, I think. Some wooden blocks. You don't have to. I know I don't have to. She met his eyes across the table. But Finn's been here 10 days, and I'm not going to pretend I haven't noticed he doesn't laugh. Rowan looked like she'd struck him. Not in anger, in recognition, like she'd said aloud the thing that had been keeping him up at night. I've been trying to... He started and then stopped. He pressed his fist against his mouth for a second. I've been trying to give him stable. I don't always know how to give him more than that. Stable is not nothing, Evelyn said. Don't dismiss stable. He nodded. He looked at his hands. But the carved horse is in the second crate on the left, she added. You can get it out in the morning. 2 days later, Finn laughed for the first time. It happened in the garden, of all places, when Evelyn was watering the carrot beds with the old tin can she used because the regular watering can had sprung a leak, and she misjudged the distance and sloshed a cold arc of water across his feet. He looked down at his wet boots. He looked up at her. And then he laughed. A real laugh, sudden and surprised and completely genuine. The kind of laugh that has no performance in it at all. It lasted maybe 4 seconds. Then it was done, and he was back to his considering look, examining his wet feet. Evelyn went back to watering. Her hand on the tin can was slightly unsteady. She was 30 feet away from the barn when she heard Rowan's voice. He'd been working inside and must have heard it through the wall. Was that Finn? He called out. Yes, she called back. There was a silence. What did I miss? I got his feet wet. Another silence. Then, I'll be damned. She kept watering. The reply from Great Falls came at the end of the 3rd week. Rowan read it first, which she'd asked him to do, because he understood the terms better than she did. He brought it to her in the kitchen and laid it on the table and stood back. She read it. She read it again. The number was better than she'd hoped. Not miraculous, but real. Solid enough to cover October and have something left over. She pressed both hands flat on the table. "There's a condition," Rowan said carefully. "They need an answer by the end of the month. And they want to meet on site before they sign. Someone has to show them the route." "That would be you, I suppose. If you want." She tapped the letter once with one finger. "Set up the meeting." He nodded. She looked up at him. "How did you know about this?" "Really?" He shrugged, but it wasn't a dismissive shrug. It was the kind that meant the answer was complicated, and he was deciding how much of it to say. When you've spent a year finding out how the world works when you've got nothing, you find out things that people with something don't usually need to know. She held his gaze for a moment. "That's the most honest thing you've said since you got here." "I've been trying to be honest." "I know." She folded the letter. "I know you have." It was the closest thing to an acknowledgement she had given him, and they both knew it, and neither of them pressed it any further because that was another of those things that worked better as a foundation than as a conversation. What broke between them, if broke is the right word, if something can break in a direction that opens rather than closes, happened a week after that, in the middle of an argument about the cattle. She had been holding off telling him about the loan terms in full. Not hiding them, she'd mentioned October, mentioned the shortfall, but she hadn't given him the exact number, the complete picture, the thing she'd been sitting alone with for 2 years. She told herself it wasn't his business. This was still her ranch. Gerald's ranch by name, hers by labor. But the truth was she'd been holding it the way people hold things that frighten them. Close, and alone, and tight enough that they don't have to look at them directly. It came out on a Wednesday evening when she was trying to decide whether to sell 2 more head before the fall market dropped. And Rowan said something about timing, a reasonable, careful, accurate thing about market timing. And something in her just cracked open. "You don't know what it's been like," she said. He stopped. 2 years, she said. By myself. Every decision, every repair, every night looking at those numbers and knowing that one bad month is the difference between keeping this place and losing it. And there is nobody. There is not a single person I can call when I don't know what to do. Her voice was level, but her hands were not. Gerald was a good man, but he was not a practical man. And when he died, he left me a beautiful homestead with a beautiful loan on it, and no instructions and no contingencies. And I have been making it up as I go for 2 years, and I am so—" She stopped. The kitchen was very quiet. Rowan said, "I know. You don't, not the specifics, but I know what it is to not have anyone." He said it plainly, not reaching for it, not trying to make it bigger than it was. The year after Clara died, every decision I made, every single one, I made alone, with Finn sitting there watching me figure out whether I'd gotten it right. That's a particular kind of tired, the kind that doesn't come from working too hard. She looked at him. She had been furious, she realized. Not at him specifically, or not only at him, at all of it. At Walter Crane's lie, at Gerald's impracticality, at 12 years, at the drought, at the bank, at the whole accumulation of things that had been done to her and around her and in spite of her. "I don't know how to stop being angry," she said. It came out quieter than she expected. "I know." He didn't say anything. He didn't try to fix it. She sat down. She was tired in that particular way, the way he'd named it, the kind that didn't come from work. Finn appeared in the kitchen doorway. He was holding the carved horse from Gerald's nephew's things in one hand and the tin horse in the other, and he looked between his father and Evelyn with those dark, steady eyes, assessing. Then he walked over to the table and put the tin horse in front of Evelyn, just set it down in front of her and stepped back. She looked at it, at the worn paint, at the cracked leg, at the small weight of the thing. She looked at Finn. "Thank you," she said. He nodded, very serious. He went back to the doorway and sat down with the carved horse and began working out some complicated interaction between the two animals that required most of his attention. Rowan was watching her. She picked up the tin horse. She turned it over in her hands once, the way Finn had let her do the first morning, that same careful gesture. Then she set it back down where Finn had left it. "I'll sell the 2 head," she said. "Thursday, before the price drops further." Rowan said, "Thursday's right." They went back to the numbers. The evening came on outside, blue and thick and finally, mercifully, a few degrees cooler than it had been, and from the doorway came the quiet sounds of a boy conducting important diplomatic negotiations between a tin horse and a carved one, and the windmill turned outside in the dark, steady now, no longer grinding, carrying its sound out across the dry Montana flats, where the rain still hadn't come, but where, for the first time in a long time, the silence inside the house had company. Neither of them said anything about it, but they both felt it, that low, careful thing building between obligation and something older, something that had been waiting for 12 years in letters that never arrived, patient and stubborn as a weed growing up through concrete, biding its time until someone finally stopped standing on it. The tin horse sat between them on the table. Outside, the Montana sky was turning the deep indigo of late summer, and somewhere to the north, so far away it was barely a whisper on the wind, something was changing in the weather. Neither Evelyn nor Rowan knew it yet. Neither of them could have said what was coming. But the air that night had a different quality to it, a pressure, a heaviness, as if the sky was finally deciding to do something after all those weeks of doing nothing. The windmill caught the edge of it and turned a little faster. The rain didn't come. What came instead, 3 days after that strange heaviness settled into the air, was wind. Not the dry, grinding wind that had been pushing dust across the flats all summer, but something different, a wind with an edge to it, coming down from the north ridge with a smell that Evelyn couldn't quite name at first. She was in the barn when she caught it, pitching hay for the horses, and she stopped with the fork mid-swing and stood there with her nose up like an animal testing the air. Smoke. Not close, not immediate, but there. She set the fork against the wall and walked out to the yard and looked north. The sky above the ridge was the same hard blue it always was, but at the tree line, right at the tree line, maybe 8 or 10 miles out, there was a smudge, a brownish haze that wasn't cloud and wasn't dust. Rowan was coming back from the north fence with the wire stretcher over his shoulder. He stopped when he saw her standing there looking. "You smell that?" she asked. He set the wire stretcher down and turned north. A long pause. "Yeah." "How long do you think?" He didn't answer right away, which was its own kind of answer. When Rowan went quiet on a practical question, it meant the answer was worse than he wanted to say. "Wind's coming this direction," he said finally. "It's dry as paper out there. The grass, the timber on the north slope." He stopped. "Who's the nearest neighbor with a bell?" "The Pattersons, 2 miles east." "Have they rung it?" She listened. The wind moved through the yard, rattling the barn door she'd just gotten fixed, lifting a layer of dust from the drive. No bell. "Not yet," she said. "Go inside and get Finn." Something in his voice made her move without arguing, which was not usually how she operated. She went inside, got Finn up from his midday nap. He was confused and warm-faced and clutched his tin horse by reflex, and brought him to the kitchen. She stood him on the chair so he could see her face clearly. "I need you to stay right here," she said. "Right in this kitchen. Can you do that?" He looked at her. He looked at the tin horse. He nodded. "Good boy." She went back outside. Rowan had climbed to the top of the windmill. From up there he could see over the tree line, and when he came back down, his face was set in a way she hadn't seen before. Not panicked, but tightened down, all the ordinary expression compressed into something harder and more efficient. "It's moving fast," he said. "Wind's got it. I can see the front edge. It's maybe 6 miles, could be less. It's coming through dry timber, and there's nothing wet between here and the ridge." Evelyn looked at her house, at the barn, at the chicken coop and the garden and the windmill and the repaired fence and 12 years of other people's work and 2 years of her own. "The cattle," she said. "I'll open the north gate and push them south. They'll run from the smoke." He was already moving toward the barn. "You start wetting the roof. Every barrel you've got. The pump's working. Fill everything you can find and start throwing water on the south face of the cabin. Get it as wet as you can. Wet burlap on the window frames if you have it." "I have it." "Good." He had the barn open now, was pulling the horses out by their halters, and they were already nervous, already pulling, one of them making that high awful sound that horses make when they're frightened. "Evelyn." She was already moving toward the pump. "What?" "If it comes over the ridge faster than I think—" He stopped. He had both horses by the lead now, and they were fighting him slightly, dancing sideways. "Don't wait for me. You take Finn, and you go south on the road. You don't wait." She looked at him across the yard, at the two frightened horses, at the smudge above the tree line that was already, she realized, a little darker than it had been 10 minutes ago. "Get the cattle out," she said. She went to the pump. The next hour was the most purely physical hour of Evelyn's life. She worked the pump until her arms shook, filling every barrel, every bucket, every pot and pan she owned. She climbed the roof twice with buckets, sloshing water across the shingles until they darkened and ran, soaking the ridge line and the south-facing eave. She stuffed wet burlap around every window frame on the north and west sides of the cabin, tying it in place with fence wire. She moved the chicken coop, physically dragged it by herself, the chickens inside going insane, to the far south side of the barn where there was a patch of bare ground. She did all of this without stopping to think, because thinking would have meant looking north, and looking north would have cost her time she didn't have. She heard the bell at the Pattersons at some point during that hour. 2 miles away, distant and clear in the dry air. And then, fainter, from the other direction, another bell. The valley was waking up to it. She could hear beneath the wind the faint sounds of people doing what she was doing, moving fast, working hard, trying to save what they'd built. Rowan came back without the cattle, which meant the cattle had gone. He was breathing hard, and his shirt was dark with sweat, and there was already a faint smell of smoke on him. Closer now, real. He looked at the roof, at the window frames, at the bare patch of ground she'd created around the cabin by dragging everything away. "When did you do all this?" he asked. "Just now." She handed him a full bucket. "Get the barn roof." He took it without a word. They worked side by side for another 30 minutes, and in that time, the sky to the north changed color. It went from blue to a yellowish brown that Evelyn had no good word for, and the wind picked up further, and the smell of smoke went from something she could detect if she was paying attention to something that was simply there, present and thick, sitting in the back of her throat. Finn appeared in the cabin doorway. She told him to stay in the kitchen. He had stayed in the kitchen for approximately as long as a 2-year-old could be expected to stay somewhere frightening when the adults he depended on were outside making urgent sounds. Now he stood in the doorway with his tin horse and his wide, dark eyes and looked at the sky. Evelyn crossed the yard in about 6 steps and picked him up. He wrapped his legs around her waist and didn't say anything, just pressed his face against her neck and held on. "I've got you," she said. It came out automatically, the way things do when you've been around a frightened child for long enough that you start talking like a mother without deciding to. "I've got you, Finn." He didn't loosen his grip. Rowan came around the corner of the barn and stopped when he saw them. Something crossed his face, complicated, compressed, and then he moved forward. "We've done what we can do," he said. "It's time." "We have not done everything, Evelyn." His voice was quiet, but it had something in it that made her stop. I was looking at her the way he'd looked at her across the kitchen table the night she'd told him she didn't know how to stop being angry, honest, direct, unflinching. A house can burn. A family cannot be replaced. She looked at the cabin, at the wet roof, the burlap frames, the swept ground, at everything she had done with her own hands to try to save it, at Gerald's kitchen and her mother's button box and the account book and the photograph on the mantelpiece. Her and Gerald on their wedding day, both of them squinting into the sun, both of them trying. Finn tightened his arms around her neck. She turned away from the cabin. "My father's things are on the mantelpiece shelf," she said. Her voice was controlled. "There's a small silver piece. It looks like a watch case, but it doesn't open. And the photograph. I'll get them." "Rowan?" He was already inside. She stood in the yard holding Finn and looked north and felt the first real fear go through her. Not the productive fear that made you move and work and fill buckets, but the other kind, the useless kind that just arrives and sits in you like cold water. The tree line above the ridge was gone. In its place was an orange-edged darkness, moving and alive. And even from here she could hear it, not the crackling she'd expected, but something lower and steadier, like weather, like the world itself burning. Rowan came out. He had the silver piece in his shirt pocket. He had the photograph tucked against his chest, and he was carrying something else, her red dress, the one she wore on washing days, the one hanging on the hook behind the bedroom door. She had no idea why he'd taken it, and she didn't ask. "Move," he said. They moved. The road south was not empty. The Pattersons were ahead of them, their wagon loaded with children and furniture, their horses at a trot. The DeLacy family came from the Eastern Fork, Frank DeLacy on foot, his wife, and their 3 children on the mule they kept for hauling. People emerged from every property, carrying what they could carry, leaving what they couldn't. Nobody talked much. That was the thing Evelyn would remember later. How quiet it was, underneath the wind. People moved with their heads down and their loads in their arms and their eyes on the road, and the only sounds were footsteps and wagon wheels and the low running noise of the fire still a mile or 2 back. But coming, always coming, eating the distance between itself and everything in its path. Rowan carried Finn. She hadn't asked him to. Finn had simply transferred himself from her arms to his father's when Rowan moved close enough, the way children do, reading the situation and making practical adjustments. Rowan had Finn on his left arm, and with his right he caught Evelyn's elbow when the road went rough, steadying her without making a thing of it, the way you steady someone you've walked beside for a long time. She noticed. She didn't say anything. The Henderson boy, 16, the kind of young man who has recently discovered he is strong and hasn't yet learned to be careful about it, fell in beside them on the road. He was breathing hard, carrying a wooden box she recognized as his mother's sewing things. "You get your stock out?" he asked Rowan. "Cattle went south on their own. Horses are on the road behind us." "We lost our barn already." The boy said it flat, like he was reporting a weather fact. Then his voice changed, just slightly. "My pa built that barn." Nobody answered him. There wasn't anything to say that was true and also comforting, and nobody on that road was in the mood for lies, comfortable or otherwise. They reached the river as the sun disappeared. It didn't set. It was swallowed by the smoke, which had built into a wall across the northern sky that blocked the light the way thunderheads do, turning everything the color of old brass. The river was shallow this time of year, the drought having done its work there too, but it was water, and water was what they needed. Families spread out along the bank. Children were waded into the knees. Horses drank. Mrs. Patterson, who was 73 and had been on this land for 40 years, sat down on a rock at the water's edge and looked north and didn't cry, which was somehow worse than if she had. Evelyn stood in the shallows with water covering her boots and looked at the sky above where her ranch was. She could see the glow, orange against the dark smoke, pulsing slightly when the wind moved. She could not tell from here what was burning and what wasn't. She could not tell whether the wet roof and the burlap frames and the swept ground had done anything at all, or whether all of it was gone. The kitchen, the account book, the button box with her mother's buttons, the settee where Finn had slept that first night. Rowan appeared beside her. Finn was asleep again. Impossible, but there he was, asleep on his father's shoulder, in the middle of all of it, his small body having apparently decided that he had reached his limit of stimulation and was checking out for a while, still holding the tin horse. "You should sit down," Rowan said. "I'm all right." "Ev," he said it gently, "you've been running for 3 hours. Sit down." She sat down on the bank. The ground was cold where the river had reached it, and then pulled back. Around her, the sounds of the valley going through its worst night. A child crying somewhere down the bank, a horse that wouldn't settle, 2 men arguing about whether to go back, Frank DeLacy's wife praying under her breath in French, which somehow seemed less like prayer and more like keeping herself company. Rowan sat down beside her, not close enough to be a statement, but close enough that she was aware of him. "I should have started filling barrels 3 weeks ago," she said. "When the wind started changing. I should have known." Nobody knew. This moved faster than anyone expected. "I knew the ridge was dry. I could see it every morning. She stopped. "I had other things to focus on." "You had a ranch to run. You were running it." He paused. "There's only one of you." She was quiet for a moment. The glow above the ridge shifted, brightened, and she felt her chest tighten. "What if it's gone?" she said. Not dramatically, just a question. Just the thing that had been sitting in her throat since she'd turned away from the cabin. "What if we get back tomorrow and there's nothing there?" He didn't answer immediately. She'd learned in the past few weeks that this was one of the more trustworthy things about him. He didn't reach for the comfortable answer. He sat with the hard question and gave it real consideration. "Then we figure out what comes next," he said. I know it's not enough, but it's true." He shifted Finn slightly against his shoulder. The boy didn't wake. "You built this place once. You kept it alive for 2 years alone. Whatever's there tomorrow, you'll know what to do with it. She looked at him. What about the loan? One thing at a time. The loan is not a one thing at a time problem, Rowan. No, but it's a tomorrow problem, and tonight is a tonight problem. He turned to look at her, and in the strange orange dark light, his face was stripped of everything except what was actually there. Tonight you're alive. Finn's alive. That's where we are right now. She looked at Finn, at the tin horse still in his sleeping fist, at the small rise and fall of his chest. She thought about what Rowan had said in the yard. A house can burn. A family cannot be replaced. She hadn't missed the word. Family. She hadn't corrected him either. Down the bank, someone had built a small fire, with the grim practicality of people who know that the enemy is a different fire entirely, and that cold is also dangerous. People were gathering around it, the Henderson boy, the DeLaceys. 3 other families she recognized. Mrs. Patterson, who someone had helped off her rock and wrapped in a blanket. "Come on," Evelyn said. She stood up. She held her hand down to Rowan. He looked at her hand for a moment. She could see him deciding whether to read anything into it, and then took it and let her help him up, Finn still balanced on his other arm. She didn't let go immediately. She held on for a second or two, more than was strictly necessary for the purpose of helping someone stand. Then she did let go, and they walked toward the fire, and she did not look back at the glow in the north because she had made a decision to be here, in this moment, with these people. And looking back was not going to help any of it. The night was long. People slept in shifts or didn't sleep at all. Someone had brought coffee, Evelyn never knew who, and it went around in mismatched cups, passed hand to hand without anyone keeping track of whose cup was whose. The Henderson boy fell asleep sitting up and nobody woke him. Mrs. Patterson told a story about the blizzard of '61 with a flat, unsentimental precision that was more comforting than any reassurance, because it was evidence, concrete and personal, that terrible things could be survived. Finn woke around midnight, confused and frightened, and Evelyn was the one closest to him when he made that sound. That small, surfacing from sleep sound she'd first heard on a morning that felt very long ago now. She reached for him without thinking. He came to her without hesitation. She held him against her chest in the firelight, with his heart hammering against her collarbone, and she felt something move through her that she didn't have a name for and didn't try to name. Rowan was watching from across the fire. She looked at him over Finn's head. She didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say that the moment wasn't already saying. He looked back at her with an expression she recognized from when they were young. That open, unguarded thing he'd never been able to help. The thing that had made her trust him the first time and hate him so thoroughly when she thought he'd gone. Except now it was older, and it had more behind it, and it didn't frighten her the way it once had. She looked down at Finn. His breathing had slowed. He was almost back to sleep. She pressed her cheek against the top of his head, just briefly. Rowan turned to look at the fire. Neither of them slept. By 4 a.m, the wind had dropped. It happened gradually, the steady pressure easing, the tops of the trees along the riverbank going still, the smoke beginning to thin in a way that changed the quality of the dark. Around 5, a smell came that Evelyn placed before she consciously recognized it. The clean, metallic smell of water and air, the specific smell of rain on its way. She stood up. Rowan. He was awake, had been awake. She didn't think he'd slept at all. He looked up. "Rain," she said. He turned his face up, and she watched him catch it too. That change in the smell of the air. He said nothing. But something in his shoulders changed. The rain started an hour later, and when it came, it didn't come lightly. It came the way rain comes after a long refusal, all at once, committed, as if making up for lost time. It hit the river surface in a hiss. It hit the dry ground, and the smell of it coming up from the earth was the most violent smell of the whole night, stronger than the smoke had been. A smell like something being woken from a long sleep. People around the fire stood up. Some of them held their hands out, palms up, and stood there with their faces tilted to the sky. Frank DeLacy's wife stopped praying in French and started crying in English. Evelyn stood in the rain and let it soak through her hair and her dress and her boots, and she did not cry and she did not speak. She just stood there and let it happen. Rowan stood next to her. Finn, on his father's shoulder, reached one small hand out into the rain with an expression of pure scientific curiosity, watching the water collect in his palm. "Well," Rowan said. "Yeah," Evelyn said. They stood there in the rain, the three of them, while the valley's long drought ended in the middle of its worst night. The fire burned for another 2 hours. But the rain found it, and the wind that had driven it was gone, and what had been racing and unstoppable became slower, then patchy, then a matter of wet ash and smoke rising from a ridge that would be black and bare for a long time, but would, eventually, grow back. By the time gray morning light arrived, people were already talking about going back. Not immediately. The ground between here and there was uncertain, and there might be spots still burning, and nobody was reckless enough to walk back into that before they could see clearly. But the conversations were happening, the practical kind, the ones that start with "when we get back" rather than "if," and that shift in language was everything. Evelyn sat on the riverbank in the rain that had gentled to a steady drizzle, with Finn asleep in her lap. He'd migrated there sometime in the early morning hours, and she'd stopped trying to arrange him differently because he was asleep, and moving him seemed cruel. And she thought about what she would find when she went back. She thought about it squarely, the way she tried to do with all the hard things. Not looking away, not looking at it sideways. The cabin might be gone. That was real. Or the roof might have caught despite her work, or the barn might be cinders, or the well might have been damaged by heat, or any number of things that she could not control might have happened in the dark while she sat here by a river holding someone else's child. Or it might still be there. She didn't know. What she knew was that either way, she was going back. Rowan came and sat beside her with 2 cups of coffee, the same battered pot making its 3rd round of the morning, and handed her one without a word. She took it. Finn slept on, oblivious, trusting in the way of small children that whatever the adults sorted out would be sufficient. "When the Henderson boy's father comes back from scouting," Evelyn said, "I'm going with the first group." "I know." "You don't have to eat." "Evelyn." His voice was quiet. "Stop." She looked at him. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. "I told you that. In the yard last night. I meant it then, and I mean it more now, if that's possible." She held his gaze for a moment. The drizzle moved through the gray morning air. Down the bank, someone's horse shook itself and sent water in a wide arc. "You said family," she said. He didn't look away. "I know what I said." "We haven't—" She stopped, started again. "There are things we haven't talked about, things that still need to be said." "I know that too. I'm not forgiving 12 years over a cup of coffee by a river. I'm not asking you to." She looked down at Finn, at the tin horse still in his hand even in sleep. She thought about what it meant that this child, who had lost his mother, who had spent a year moving through the world without a place to land, had put his tin horse, the most important object in his possession, in front of her on a kitchen table. She thought about what that was, coming from a 2-year-old, what it cost, what it meant. "Okay," she said. Rowan looked at her. "Okay, what?" "Okay," she said again. "We'll figure it out." It wasn't a declaration. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't a beginning. It wasn't any of the things that people in stories said to each other when the worst was over and the future was waiting. It was just 2 words that meant, "I'm not done. I'm still here. Whatever this is, I'm not walking away from it." Rowan understood. She could see him understand it, the same way he'd understood the silence in the kitchen, the same way he'd known not to press her when she needed the minute. He nodded once. He looked at his son. The first gray light of morning moved across the river, and somewhere across the valley a bird started. Small, persistent, utterly unconcerned with what the night had done. And Finn's hand tightened around the tin horse in his sleep, and the drizzle kept falling on everything, on the ash and the burned ridge, and the wet flats, and the people sitting along the river with their coffee and their losses and their unasked questions. The Henderson boy came back from scouting at a run, and his face, young and serious in the wet morning light, said everything before he opened his mouth. "The road's clear," he said, "and some of the houses—" He was breathing hard. He looked at the gathered group, at the Pattersons and the DeLacys and Evelyn and Rowan and the others who had come down to the river with their lives in their arms. Some of them are still standing. Nobody moved for a moment. Then Mrs. Patterson, 73 years old and 40 years on this land, stood up from her blanket and said, "Well, Let's go see what we've got." And one by one, they got up. The walk back was 2 miles, and it took them a long time. Not because the road was impassable. The Henderson boy had said it was clear, and it was, mostly, though there were places where the smoke had settled into a wet gray silt that made the footing uncertain, and one section where a fence had come down across the road, and they climbed through it instead of around it. The way people move when they're not sure what they're walking toward, when the difference between what they're hoping for and what they might find is large enough to make the legs cautious, even when the mind says go. Evelyn walked with Finn on her hip. He'd woken up during the first mile, quiet and observant, taking in the black-edged landscape on either side of the road with those dark eyes that missed nothing. The grass along the road verges was burned in patches. Not continuous burning, but the spotty, irregular kind, where the fire had touched and lifted and touched again depending on how the wind had moved. The fence posts were still standing in most places, just scorched. The wire between them was fine. Fire doesn't take wire. She kept her eyes on the road in front of her. Rowan walked on her left, close enough that his arm brushed hers when the road narrowed. He didn't say anything. She was grateful for that. There was a particular kind of silence that was companionable and a particular kind that was just waiting, and this was the first kind which she hadn't had enough of in 2 years. They came around the long curve above the south pasture, and the ranch came into view. Evelyn stopped walking. Everyone near her stopped too, or maybe she just stopped noticing them. The barn was standing. The north face was blackened from the eave to the ground. The fire had come close enough to char the siding, close enough that she could see from here where the paint had bubbled and peeled, but the structure was intact. The roof was intact. The chicken coop she'd dragged to the south side was sitting exactly where she'd left it, and the chickens inside were making the particular outraged sound of chickens who feel their circumstances do not reflect their dignity. The cabin was standing. She had to look twice. She had built herself, during the long night, a careful and practical acceptance of the possibility that it would be gone. She had held that possibility steadily in mind, had turned it over, had said to herself, "It is a building. It is not your life. You will go on." She had believed it, mostly. And now it was standing there in the gray drizzle, smoke-stained and water-streaked and missing some shingles off the west corner, where something had clearly struck, a branch, maybe, or an ember, and the burlap around the north window frame was burned through on one side, which meant the fire had been close enough to light it before the rain came. But the walls were there. The roof was there. The door was there, standing slightly open the way she'd left it when she ran. She was crying before she knew she was going to. Not loudly, not with any kind of performance, just tears coming down her face in the same steady way the rain was coming down, because her body had apparently been holding something that it now needed to put down. Finn felt her shaking slightly and pulled back to look at her face. He examined her tears with the same serious curiosity he applied to everything. Then he put both small hands on her cheeks. She laughed, a broken, surprised sound, and covered his hands with hers. "It's okay," she told him. "It's a good kind." He considered this information. He left his hands where they were. Rowan had stopped beside her and was looking at the cabin with an expression she couldn't read from the side, but his jaw was tight and his hand was in a fist at his side. She understood that. She understood what he'd risked going back in for those things. The silver piece, the photograph, the red dress. And she understood what it meant that the building he'd run back into was still there. "You went in for nothing," she said. "I went in for something," he said. He reached into his shirt pocket and held out the silver piece. She took it. It was warm from being against his chest all night. It was her father's. A small oval of hammered silver with a family initial pressed into one face, something her father had carried his whole life and left on the mantelpiece shelf when he died, because it was the kind of thing that belonged to a place rather than a person. She'd kept it there through Gerald's tenure in the house and through the 2 years since, and had never considered moving it. She turned it over in her palm. She closed her hand around it. "Thank you," she said. She meant it for more things than the silver piece, and she thought he probably knew that. They walked down to the cabin together. The inside was smokier than the outside. The smell had gotten in through the window gaps and sat in the curtains and the floorboards and the quilt on the settee, the kind of smell that would take weeks to fully leave. The north window frame was scorched on the outer edge where the burlap had burned, and there was a crack in the chimney she'd need to have looked at before she used the stove, and the west corner where the shingles had blown had let in enough water during the rain to soak a section of the ceiling and drip onto the floor, creating a small lake in the corner of the main room that she was going to have to deal with today. She stood in the middle of the kitchen and looked at all of it. She thought about the morning she'd found Gerald in the snow, the way the first feeling had been dread rather than grief, the practicality that had come before the morning. She'd felt guilty about it for a long time. She understood it now, a little better. It wasn't that she hadn't loved Gerald in her way, and it wasn't that she wasn't capable of grief. It was that when you've been keeping something alive through sheer effort for long enough, the instinct to assess damage before feeling it becomes a reflex. It's not a cold thing. It's how you survive. She assessed. Chimney, corner leak, smoke smell, window frame, west shingles. She was already making the list. Finn had wriggled down from her arms as soon as they came inside and gone directly to the storage room where his mattress was. She heard him doing something in there, moving things, the particular busy sound of a small person with a project, and left him to it. He was home, or as close to it as anywhere had been for him in a long time. Rowan was at the north window, running his hand along the scorched frame. "I can replace this," he said. "Week's work, maybe less. Add it to the list." He looked at her over his shoulder. Something in his face shifted. "There's a list now?" "There's always been a list." She went to the stove and opened the firebox. The chimney crack would affect the draw. She wasn't going to risk a fire until she'd checked it from the outside. "We'll cook on the fire ring in the yard until I get someone to look at the chimney." "I can look at it." "You're not a mason." "No, but I've patched a chimney before." He paused. "I can tell you if it needs a mason or just mortar." She looked at him for a moment. "Fine." That was how the first day went, in the same language they'd established from the beginning, the language of tasks and assessments, the practical shorthand of two people who needed to communicate efficiently and hadn't yet built the infrastructure for anything more complicated. She cleared the water from the corner while Rowan went up on the roof to check the damage and call down his findings, which she wrote in the back of the account book because that was the paper she had at hand. Finn came out of the storage room at some point, carrying a wooden block he'd apparently located under the crates Evelyn had moved against the wall, and spent a contented half-hour building something on the kitchen floor and knocking it down. Neighbors started arriving mid-morning. Not for any prearranged reason. It just happened, the way things happen in places where people have survived hard things together. The Hendersons came first. Their barn was gone, which everyone already knew, but their cabin had made it. And the father, a broad, practical man named Dale Henderson who communicated mostly in nods and silences, came to help with the roof before he'd even been asked. He just showed up with his tools and climbed up next to Rowan and started working. The DeLacy family came an hour after that. Frank DeLacy's wife brought food, actual food, a pot of something she'd had going before the evacuation that she'd carried with her and somehow kept intact through the whole night, and she set it on the fire ring in Evelyn's yard and said, "Everyone eats," and that was that. By noon, there were 9 people working on the Mercer property, and by 2 in the afternoon, Evelyn's west corner had new shingles. The chimney had been assessed by Dale Henderson, who confirmed Rowan's judgment that it needed mortar, not a mason, and 2 of the fence posts along the north line that had burned at the base were already being replaced. She stood in the yard in the drizzle and watched this and felt something she didn't have a ready word for. Not gratitude exactly, or not only gratitude. More like the specific shock of discovering that you have been more alone than you knew, because you had forgotten what it felt like to not be. She'd been running this ranch as a solitary operation for 2 years. By choice, mostly, or what felt like choice, but was probably closer to the habit of self-sufficiency, which becomes its own kind of wall after long enough. She hadn't asked for help because asking felt like admitting the scale of what she was managing alone, and admitting that felt like weakness she couldn't afford. Dale Henderson was putting shingles on her roof without being asked. Frank DeLacy's wife was feeding her neighbors out of a pot she'd carried through an evacuation. The Henderson boy was pulling burned fence posts with his bare hands and carrying them off like it was the most ordinary thing. She went inside and stood at the kitchen window and looked at the yard full of people doing things and let herself feel it. Rowan came in to get water and found her standing there. He looked at her. He didn't ask what was wrong because nothing was wrong. He just handed her the cup he'd filled first and filled another one for himself. "I forgot," she said. "Forgot what?" "This." She gestured vaguely at the window, at the yard. "People." He stood beside her and looked out at the Hendersons and the DeLaceys and the three other families who had come without being called. "It's a good thing to remember," he said. "I should have been asking for help a long time ago." He was quiet for a moment. "It's easier to ask when you're not the only one asking. When you're the only one it feels like. Weakness," she said. "I was going to say exposure." He glanced at her. "But yeah." She looked at him, at the lines around his eyes from the night and the smoke and the years. "Is that why you came here? Because it felt less like asking than falling," he said. "Yeah, more or less." She thought about that, about the difference between asking and falling, about how sometimes people fall toward the only place that still feels solid, and that isn't weakness either, it's just gravity. "The October loan," she said. He nodded. He'd known they'd get back to it. "The timber lease will cover most of it," she said, "if they honor the terms. That's not guaranteed. We haven't signed yet, and after last night I don't know what the access route looks like. The North Slope might be a different picture now." "I thought about that this morning." He set his cup down on the counter. "Actually, the burn might help. Open terrain is easier to root through than dense timber. Less clearing required. Could be more attractive, not less." She looked at him. "You thought about this morning. When?" "At the river, around 3. I couldn't sleep." She hadn't been sleeping either, but she hadn't been thinking about timber leases. She'd been thinking about Finn with his hands on her cheeks in the rain. She'd been thinking about the word family. "We need to look at the north section today," she said. "Assess what the fire did to the terrain." "I'll go this afternoon." "We'll go," she said. He looked at her. "I know this land," she said. "You know the timber company. We go together." A pause. "All right." Finn appeared in the kitchen doorway with his tin horse and the wooden block from the storage room, having apparently decided these two objects needed to be in proximity to each other for a project that required the kitchen floor. He settled himself under the table and began working out the logistics. Evelyn looked at him under the table. Then she looked at Rowan. "He's going to need boots before winter." "I know. The ones he has are already small." "I know, Ev. There's a dry goods in Millhaven. They carry children's things." She paused. "I usually go once a month. You should come. Both of you." Rowan looked at her for a moment with that open expression she'd stopped trying to dismiss. "Yeah," he said. "We should." She went outside to help with the fence. The afternoon was hard in the physical way that she welcomed, because hard physical work was the kind of thing that didn't leave room for the other kind of thinking. She and Rowan walked the north section when the fence work was done, picking through the burn zone together. The fire had taken the timber on the upper ridge completely. It was black sticks and ash up there, nothing for miles. But the lower section, the gradual slope that ran toward the river, had caught in patches. Open patches. Exactly what Rowan had described. He walked the terrain with his eyes down, reading it the way she read her account books, in the specific, calculated way of someone who knows what they're looking for. "Here," he said, stopping at a natural shelf in the hillside where the slope leveled briefly before descending again. "This is where they'd want to cross the ridge, and from here," he turned and looked down toward the river. "They can follow the natural grade all the way to the water. No blasting required. That's their biggest cost. No blasting means this route is worth significantly more to them than what they offered." She looked at him. "You're saying we can renegotiate?" "I'm saying you have more leverage now than you did a week ago." He looked at her steadily. "The fire did you a favor on this particular thing. That's not nothing." She thought about the account book, about October, about the loan number she'd been sitting with alone for 2 years. She thought about what leverage felt like from the inside. She'd forgotten, or maybe she'd never known, because this land had always felt like the thing she was protecting rather than the thing she held. "Write the letter when we get back," she said. "Tonight?" "Tonight." They walked back down together through the patchy burn, through the places where the grass was already showing the faint ghost of green at its roots, because the rain had come, and the roots were alive, and roots do not give up as easily as the parts of the plant you can see. The drizzle had stopped sometime in the afternoon, and the sky was doing the thing it does after rain, clearing from the west, one long band of pale gold light opening above the mountains. She noticed it. She didn't say anything about it because she was a practical woman who did not make declarations about sunsets, but she noticed it. When they came back to the yard, Frank DeLacy's wife, her name was Marguerite, Evelyn had known her for 7 years and had never once called her anything but Mrs. DeLacy, which she was going to fix, was calling people to the fire ring for supper. The pot was going again, supplemented by what various families had contributed from their own stores. Dale Henderson had produced a jug of something that smelled sharp and was being passed among the adults with the solemn deliberateness of people observing a ritual. Evelyn sat on the step of her own cabin with a bowl of Marguerite DeLacy's soup and looked at her yard full of people. Finn had attached himself to the Henderson boy, who was 17 and clearly had no idea what to do with a 2-year-old, but was managing admirably, mostly by letting Finn examine his belt buckle with intense focus. The Henderson boy sat very still and patient while this examination proceeded, which told Evelyn something good about him. Rowan sat down beside her on the step. He had the jug, his turn with it, and he looked at it and then held it out to her. She took it. She drank. It was rough, and it burned, and she handed it back without coughing, which she was quietly proud of. Dale Henderson wants to come tomorrow, Rowan said. His boy, too. They want to help refence the north line. We should help them with their barn in return. I already told him that. She looked at him. You're not the only practical person here, he said mildly. She almost smiled. She caught it before it fully arrived, which was a habit she was going to have to examine at some point. The evening settled around the yard slowly, the light going gold and then amber, the fire ring throwing warmth in a circle that reached just far enough to include everyone sitting around it. Someone started talking, Dale Henderson, of all people, whose silences she'd always assumed were the whole man, turned out to have opinions about the territorial government's failure to maintain fire breaks along the northern ridge. And those opinions were detailed and specific and delivered with a dry humor that surprised everyone, including apparently Dale himself. Mrs. Patterson arrived late. She'd been at her own place all afternoon, assessing, which sounded right. And someone made room for her at the fire, and someone else got her soup, and she sat with the absolute authority of a person who has been somewhere long enough to simply belong there. Your roof? Evelyn asked her. Standing, Mrs. Patterson said. East wall is a problem. I'll need help. We'll come Thursday, Evelyn said. The old woman looked at her for a moment. You've got your own repairs. We'll come Thursday, Evelyn said again. Mrs. Patterson nodded once, the way people nod when they're not going to say thank you, because thank you is smaller than the thing being offered. Rowan was watching this exchange. He looked at the fire. Later, after people had started drifting back to their own places, the ones that were standing, and the few that weren't, had been arranged to stay with neighbors, the Hendersons taking the DeLacys in, because the DeLacy cabin had lost its roof. And that was that. Later, after Finn was asleep in his room, with the tin horse and the wooden block arranged on the floor beside him. With the careful intentionality of someone who has plans for them, in the morning, Evelyn and Rowan were alone in the kitchen with the lamp between them and the letter to Great Falls to write. He wrote. She dictated mostly, adding and adjusting as they went, and the letter that emerged was considerably more confident in its terms than the arrangement they'd agreed to a month ago. It described the new terrain accurately. It named the value of the cleared route. It proposed a revised lease figure that was, by Evelyn's private calculation, enough to handle October with room left for the winter. When they were done, Rowan read it back to her. She listened. She made one change, a single sentence about the timeline, tightening it. That's it, she said. He folded the letter. I'll take it to town in the morning. Take Finn. He needs air. You could come. She looked at him across the table, at the lamp between them, at the folded letter in his hand with the case she'd built over the last month, the account book and the numbers and the terrain walk and the timberman's logic and the rain that had finally come, all of it compressed into one document. I have a wall to patch and a chimney to mortar and 17 other things, she said. I know. And someone needs to start on Mrs. Patterson's east wall before Thursday. I'll be back by noon. She nodded. She started to get up. Evelyn. She paused. He was looking at the table, at the letter, then up at her, and there was something in his face that was careful and also past being careful, like a man who has decided to stop holding something back before the holding back does more damage than the thing itself. I know what you said at the river, he said, about not forgiving 12 years over coffee. I know there are things we haven't said, I'm not, I'm not pushing for anything. He stopped. Started again, more honest. I'm pushing for one thing. I want to stay. Not as an arrangement, not as the man who fixes what's broken and earns his place by being useful. I want to stay because this is... He looked at the kitchen, at the lamp, at the place where Finn was sleeping. Because this is the only place in 12 years that's felt like something I don't want to leave. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the windmill turned in the light post-rain breeze, steady and even, making none of the sounds it used to make. She looked at him. She thought about 14 letters that never arrived. She thought about a lie told in this kitchen by a man who was dead and couldn't be asked why. She thought about 2 years of doing everything alone and the particular cold of that kind of alone. She thought about Finn putting the tin horse on the table in front of her. She thought about the word falling, how he'd said it, the difference between asking and falling. I know, she said. He waited. I know you want to stay. She held his gaze. I'm not telling you to go. He was very still. But I need you to understand that I can't just... She stopped, tried again. I've been putting this place back together with my hands for 2 years, and I've been putting myself back together for longer than that. And I'm not done with either one. She looked at him. I need time to not be done. Okay, he said. That's it? Just okay? What else would I say? He leaned forward slightly, elbows on the table. You're telling me you're not done. You're not telling me to leave. I'm not going to argue with that, Ev. I'm here. I'm going to keep being here. You take whatever time you need. She looked at him for a long moment, at the gray in his hair and the lines around his eyes, and the particular quality of stillness he had, a stillness she'd watched develop over the past month, the steadiness of a man who'd learned through a hard year that patience was not the same as passivity. Go to bed, she said. You're taking a 2-year-old to town in the morning. He almost smiled. Good night, Ev. Good night. He took the lamp to the barn. She had a candle, and she sat alone in the near-dark kitchen for a few minutes, listening to the quiet, to the windmill, to the faint sound of Finn's breathing from the storage room, to the particular silence of a house that wasn't empty. She pressed her hand flat on the table. The blister on her palm from the fence post, the one she'd gotten the evening Rowan had walked through her gate, had healed. She hadn't noticed when. But the skin there was new and tender, the way healed things are. Not gone, exactly. Just different. She blew out the candle and went to bed, and slept, for the first time in a long time, the whole way through. The letter to Great Falls came back in 12 days. Rowan brought it in from the road on a Tuesday morning, still damp from the ride, and set it on the kitchen table without a word. Evelyn was at the stove. She turned, saw the envelope, and dried her hands on her apron before she picked it up. She read it once, standing up. Then she sat down and read it again. The timber company had accepted the revised terms. Not the full number she'd proposed. They'd come back at 15% below her ask, which was how these things worked, and which she'd accounted for in her own private calculation. The number on the page, even reduced, was enough. More than enough for October. Enough to carry the ranch through the winter with a margin she hadn't had since Gerald was alive. She set the letter down. She looked at the window, at the yard outside where the new shingles on the west corner had already weathered to nearly match the old ones, where the windmill turned in a clean September breeze, where the north fence line, restrung by Dale Henderson and his boy and Rowan over the course of 4 days, ran straight and taut to the horizon. She picked up the letter again and looked at the number. Rowan was leaning against the doorframe, watching her. He'd learned, over the weeks, the specific quality of her silences. Which ones meant she was working something out and needed the room, and which ones meant she'd worked it out and was ready to talk. He waited for the second kind. It's enough, she said. I know. You knew before I opened it. I had a feeling about the number, yeah. She looked at him. You could have told me. You needed to read it yourself. That was true, and they both knew it, and she didn't push it further. She folded the letter and put it in the account book. The same account book that had held so much dread for 2 years, now holding the solution to the dread, which felt like the kind of symmetry you don't plan for. We should go to the bank this week, she said. Before October. I don't want to be close to the date. Wednesday? Wednesday. Finn appeared from the storage room dragging the wooden horse that Dale Henderson's boy had carved for him out of a piece of pine salvaged from the burned fence posts. A gift presented with the awkward sincerity of a 17-year-old who doesn't know how to give gifts but wanted to anyway. Finn had accepted it with the gravity it deserved, and had spent the last week integrating it into the ongoing diplomatic situation between the tin horse and the carved horse, which had apparently reached some kind of alliance, because they traveled together everywhere now. He pulled both horses to the table and climbed up onto his chair. "Breakfast?" he said. It was one of approximately 11 words he used with any regularity, and he used this one with precision. Never when he wasn't actually hungry, always when he was. "Breakfast," Evelyn confirmed, and went back to the stove. Rowan sat across from his son and reached over to right the carved horse, which had tipped. Finn set it back himself, deliberately, the way he did everything, with the considered intention of someone who has learned not to rely on things staying where they're put and has decided to be the one who puts them right. It was, Evelyn thought, the most Rowan-like thing about him. She made eggs. She made biscuits from what was left of the morning's flour. She put everything on the table and sat down, and the three of them ate breakfast together in the kitchen of the Mercer Ranch. And outside, the Montana September came through the window in clean, cooled air that smelled like the end of the drought and the beginning of something else. She did not say any of this out loud. She was not, by nature, a person who narrated the moment she was in. But she felt it, the way you feel a change in pressure before you understand what weather is coming. Something present and real and not quite nameable, which is how the most important things tend to announce themselves. The bank visit on Wednesday was not the ordeal she'd been bracing for since Gerald died. She had been building it up in her mind for 2 years. The walk into the Millhaven Savings and Trust, the meeting with the loan officer whose name was Gerhardt, and whose manner was that of a man who considered sympathy an impractical expense, the sitting across a desk and doing the arithmetic of what she owed against what she had. She had rehearsed it a dozen times in the dark of various sleepless nights, and in every version of the rehearsal she felt small in a way she hated. She walked in with the signed timber lease document, the letter of commitment from the Great Falls Company, and Rowan beside her. Gerhardt looked at the documents. He looked at Rowan. He looked at Evelyn with the particular expression of a man recalibrating an assessment he'd already made. "The lease revenue covers the October payment," Evelyn said. She'd decided on the way into town that she was going to speak first and speak plainly, and that she was not going to wait for Gerhardt to tell her the situation because she already knew the situation. "It also covers the first quarter of next year. I have projections for the spring cattle sale that bring me current through June. At that point, the ranch is operating at a sustainable level, and I would like to discuss refinancing the remaining balance at a rate that reflects the improved collateral position." A pause. Gerhardt looked at the documents again. "Mrs. Mercer. Those are my terms," she said. "I'm happy to discuss the details, but that's the starting position." Another pause, longer this time. Rowan beside her said nothing. This was deliberate. She'd told him on the road that she needed to do the talking, and he'd said fine and meant it. Gerhardt took 15 minutes to review everything, during which Evelyn sat with her hands in her lap and her back straight, and her face composed in the expression she'd practiced, which was the expression of a woman who is not worried because she has done the work required to not be worried, and the numbers are the numbers. He agreed to the October payment with the lease revenue. He agreed to revisit the refinancing question in the spring. He was not warm about it, but warm had never been what she needed from a bank. She needed the math to work, and the math worked. She shook his hand across the desk and walked out into the Millhaven street with the account book under her arm and Rowan at her side. She stood on the boardwalk in the September sun for a moment and breathed. "Well?" Rowan said. "October's done," she said. He nodded. "Spring is the next problem." "Spring usually is." She looked at him sideways. "That's either wisdom or you're just telling me what I already know." "Both," he said. Finn was outside with the horses, supervised by the Henderson boy who had come into town with them on his own errand and had offered with teenage reliability and teenage obliviousness to the significance of what Evelyn was doing inside. Finn was currently trying to feed something to Rowan's horse, which was tolerating this with more patience than the horse usually showed. She watched him for a moment. This small, dark-haired boy who had arrived in her life with a worn tin horse and a considered silence and the complete absence of any ability to explain what he needed, who had simply put his hands on her cheeks in the rain and let that be enough. "He called me Mom," she said. Rowan went very still. "Last night." She kept her voice even. It cost her something to keep it even. "He woke up. I don't know, some noise outside. I heard him stir. I went in to check. He wasn't scared, he was just awake. He looked up at me and said—" She stopped, cleared her throat. "He said, 'Mom,' just like that. Like it was the word for what I was, and he'd simply gotten around to saying it." Rowan didn't speak for a moment. She could see him very carefully, not letting his face do what it wanted to do. "What did you do?" he asked. "I tucked him back in," she said. "I said goodnight. I went back to my room and I sat on the edge of the bed for about 10 minutes. And? And then I decided that was the right word," she said. "If he thinks it's the right word, then it is." Rowan looked at her. His jaw was tight in that way, the fist at the side way. "Ev, don't make a thing of it," she said. "I'm just telling you because you should know." He pressed his lips together and nodded once. She walked out to where Finn was conducting negotiations with the horse. October settled over the valley the way October does in Montana. Abruptly, completely, with a hard frost in the first week that finished the garden and turned the hills every color at once before stripping them clean. The work changed with the season. Summer's emergency repairs gave way to winter preparations. Laying in hay, checking the cattle's condition, banking the cabin walls with sod on the north side, splitting enough wood to last through February, and then splitting more because February could always get worse. Rowan worked with the same quality of attention he'd brought to everything since he'd arrived. Not the performing effort quality that some men had, where the work was also a demonstration of the working. He just worked. He figured out what needed doing and did it in the right order. And if something didn't go right the first time, he went at it again from a different angle. And he didn't talk much while he was doing it, but when he did talk, it was worth listening to. She had stopped noticing the gray at his temples. She had stopped noticing the things that marked him as different from the young man she'd known, because those markers had become just part of what he looked like, the way a landscape becomes ordinary once you've lived in it long enough. What she noticed now was the particular way he moved through a yard when he had a plan, purposeful but not hurried. The way he listened when she talked about the cattle or the finances, not waiting for his turn to speak, but actually processing what she said and building on it. The way he was with Finn, not performing fatherhood, not compensating for the year of upheaval, just present, consistently and honestly present, in the daily, unremarkable way that is harder than any dramatic gesture. She noticed these things. She was honest with herself about noticing them. The conversation they needed to have came on a Thursday evening in late October, the week after she'd paid the bank and squared the account book for the first time in 2 years. Finn was in bed. Rowan had been in the barn finishing something and came inside late, and she had kept the coffee warm because she'd been waiting, not because he needed coffee, but because she needed the conversation, and the coffee was something to do with her hands during it. He came in and saw her at the table and understood immediately. He washed his hands and sat down and accepted the coffee. "I've been thinking," she said. "I know." "You don't know what I've been thinking?" "No," he said. "But I know you've been thinking it for about 2 weeks. You get a specific look." She looked at him. "What look?" "Like you're doing the accounting on something that isn't in the book." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "That's uncomfortably accurate." "What's the number?" he said. "What did you come up with?" She looked at the table, at the account book she'd pushed to one side, at the coffee, at 12 years of not having this conversation and at least 2 months of working up to it. "I came up with the fact that I've been waiting to stop being angry, and I don't think I'm going to stop being angry. I think the anger is just part of it now, part of what happened, part of what I carry." She met his eyes. "And I've been waiting until I didn't carry it anymore before I let anything else happen. But I think that's the wrong order." He didn't say anything. "I think you carry things while you live," she said, "not instead of it." Rowan set his cup down very carefully. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I'm done waiting to be finished being angry before I—" She stopped. She was a practical woman, and she was going to say this in plain language. "Before I tell you that I want you to stay, not as an arrangement, not as the man who fixes the fence and earns his bed in the barn. She held his gaze. As the person who eats breakfast at this table. As Finn's father. As... She stopped again, steadied herself. As whatever you were going to be 12 years ago before someone decided for us. The kitchen was absolutely still. Rowan looked at her with an expression that was unguarded in a way she hadn't seen since he was 23 years old, sitting on the fence at the edge of her father's property, telling her things he'd never told anyone. The same open, undefended look. Older now, cracked by more years, but the same thing underneath. I need to say something, he said. His voice was careful. And I need you to let me finish it before you respond. She nodded. I know I'm not the person you would have chosen if none of it had happened, he said. I know 12 years changed you and they changed me, and we are not the same people who, whatever we were to each other at 22, that's not recoverable. I'm not asking for it back. He paused. What I'm asking for is what's here now, which is different and harder and real. And I think it might be more than what we had then, not less, because we're not kids anymore, and we know what we're choosing. Another pause. That's what I want to say. She looked at him for a long moment. That was a good thing to say, she said. I meant it. I know you did. She picked up her coffee, put it down. I'm not 22 either. I know what I'm choosing. He reached across the table. Not dramatically, not with any announcement. He just put his hand on the table, open, and left it there. She looked at his hand, at the calluses and the working man's knuckles, and the particular shape of a hand that had spent 2 months repairing everything she'd let go too long. She put her hand in his. Neither of them spoke for a while. The lamp burned. The windmill turned outside in the October dark. From Finn's room came the complete silence of a child sleeping without nightmares, which was something he'd stopped having sometime in September, around the time the word mom became part of his vocabulary. The barn is not sufficient for a Montana winter, Evelyn said finally. Rowan looked at her. There's a room off the north side, she said. Gerald built it for storage, but it's solid, proper walls. It connects to the cabin through the kitchen. She looked at the table. It needs a wood stove. I've been meaning to get one in there for 2 years. He was quiet for a moment. Are you telling me to get a wood stove? I'm telling you where you're sleeping this winter, she said, and I'm telling you it needs a wood stove. She met his eyes. One thing at a time. He almost smiled. She saw it. One thing at a time, he said. The wood stove was in by the following week, installed by Rowan and Dale Henderson, in a single long Saturday that involved a great deal of discussion about flue angles and a minor disagreement about mortar that Dale won by virtue of being older and more stubborn. Finn supervised from the corner, sitting on an upturned crate with his 2 horses, providing commentary in the form of occasional pronouncements that nobody could fully interpret, but that sounded authoritative. The winter that followed was the hardest kind, not catastrophic, but long and grinding and honest about its length. 2 feet of snow in November, a cold snap in December that cracked 2 fence posts and froze the water trough 3 days running and kept the cattle huddled in the south barn looking aggrieved. January arrived with the specific cruelty of a month that knows you're tired of it before it started. Evelyn and Rowan worked through all of it. Some days they worked well together, and some days they didn't. There was an argument in December about the cattle rotation that lasted 3 days and was not entirely about cattle, and a week in January when they were both so worn down by the cold and the workload that they moved through the house in near silence, and the silence was not the comfortable kind. She burned supper twice and was furious about it both times in a disproportionate way that had nothing to do with the supper. He left tools in the wrong places twice, which was a small thing that shouldn't have mattered as much as it did, and they both knew it didn't matter, and neither of them said so. These things passed. Not perfectly, not with apologies that resolved everything cleanly, but in the way real things pass, gradually, with some friction, and without anyone winning because winning wasn't the point. Finn turned 3 in February. Evelyn made a cake from the last of the winter's sugar, and Rowan got him a small leather saddle for the carved horse, cut and stitched over 2 weeks of evenings in the north room, working by lamplight after Finn was asleep. When Finn opened it in the morning, he held it for a long time without saying anything. Then he put it on the carved horse with extreme concentration. Then he looked up at Rowan and said, "Good." Rowan said, "Happy birthday, bud." Finn nodded. He looked at Evelyn. "Cake," he said. "Cake," she confirmed. They ate cake for breakfast, which was not something Evelyn had done since she was a child, and was one of those small things that turns out to matter more than you expect. Spring came the way spring always came to Montana. Badly. First, with one last snowstorm in March that dumped 14 inches overnight and made Rowan say several things in the yard that morning that Evelyn chose not to hear, and then slowly, grudgingly, with mud and ice melt and the cattle starting to move again, like they'd remembered they had legs. And then suddenly, and all at once, the way spring always finally arrives after you've stopped believing it will. The hay came in strong. The revised cattle numbers, smaller herd than Gerald had run, but better quality. She'd made some strategic trades over the winter, produced a spring sale that exceeded what she'd projected to the bank. The spring meeting with Gerhardt was not the ordeal she'd expected. She walked in with the numbers and he looked at them and said the refinancing could be arranged, and she nodded and said fine, and they arranged it. She walked out into the Millhaven spring and thought, this is what it feels like when the math works. She went directly to the dry goods store and bought Finn new boots. He'd been wearing the previous pair since fall and had clearly been experiencing them as more of a suggestion than a shoe for at least 2 months, and stood in the store holding them while Finn examined a display of colored ribbons with the focused attention of a person with extremely specific taste. She thought about the morning she'd first seen him, asleep on his father's shoulder with his fist around a tin horse, in a man's arms held together by wire. The completely trusting weight of a child who had no real reason to trust and trusted anyway, because children do that. They trust what's present, what shows up, what stays. She thought about what it cost a person to stay. She thought about the barn step, and the riverbank, and the kitchen table, and the slowly accumulated ordinary evidence of a man who said he would stay and then stayed, not because it was easy, but because he'd decided to and meant it. She bought the boots. She bought the ribbons too, because Finn was still considering them, and she wasn't in a hurry. The proposal, when it came, was not what she expected. She had been expecting, if she was honest, something that matched the gravity of the thing. Some formal moment, some arrangement of words. She was not by nature a romantic woman, but she had a sense of what the occasion called for. What actually happened was a January evening the following winter, their second winter together, Finn 4 years old and acquiring opinions at a rate that was genuinely alarming, the cabin warm from the stove and the lamp going and the account book closed for the night in a way that meant the numbers were all right, which they were, which was still something she registered with conscious gratitude every time it was true. Rowan was sitting on the floor by the fireplace with Finn, the two of them conducting some kind of elaborate military campaign involving the tin horse, the carved horse, and 4 wooden blocks that represented terrain. Evelyn was in the chair with the mending, doing the thing she'd been doing more often lately, which was watching them without appearing to watch, which she suspected neither of them was fooled by. Rowan looked up from the campaign. He looked at her. He said, "Evelyn." She said, "What?" He said, "Will you marry me?" Not a production, not on one knee. He'd have to get up off the floor and then go down on a knee, and the whole maneuver would wake Finn's attention, and then there'd be questions, and Finn's questions, while worthwhile, were not what the moment called for. Just, "Will you marry me?" Level, honest. The same way he'd said everything else, without performance, without the shape of the thing replacing the thing. Finn looked up from the campaign. He looked at his father. He looked at Evelyn. He appeared to process what had been asked. "Yes," he said to Evelyn. She laughed. She laughed properly, the way she hadn't in a long time, surprised out of herself. Rowan was watching her with that open expression, the unguarded one, waiting. "Finn already answered," she said. "I noticed," he said, "but I was asking you." She held his gaze across the warm room. She thought about all the things she'd said and hadn't said, and all the ground they'd walked over to get here, and all the things that had been taken from them, and all the things they'd built with what was left, which turned out to be enough, which turned out to be more than enough. "Yes," she said. Finn nodded, satisfied, and returned to the campaign. They were married in May on the front step of the cabin, in front of the neighbors and a traveling justice of the peace who smelled like the road and performed the ceremony with efficient pleasantness. Evelyn wore a blue dress, not the red one. The red one was folded in the cedar chest at the foot of the bed, kept there deliberately, a piece of charred hem saved from the wildfire, the night when everything could have gone and didn't. She didn't need to wear it to remember what it meant. She just needed to know it was there. Finn stood between them during the ceremony in his good boots, holding the tin horse in one hand and the carved horse in the other, watching the justice of the peace with the sober assessment of a 4-year-old who takes official proceedings seriously. When the ceremony was over, Dale Henderson shook Rowan's hand for a long time, and Mrs. Patterson kissed Evelyn on the cheek and said nothing, which was more than enough. Marguerite de Lacy cried. Frank de Lacy patted her back with the helpless patience of a man who has decided tears are simply part of his life and has made his peace with it. There was food. There was Dale Henderson's jug again, making its rounds. There was a fiddle, produced from somewhere, played badly and enthusiastically by someone whose name Evelyn never caught. Finn ate 3 pieces of cake and fell asleep under the table with both horses, and had to be carried to bed by Rowan, who came back outside and found Evelyn standing at the edge of the yard looking north. Not at the ridge where the fire had come from, at the new growth. The black sticks of last summer's burn were already filling in. Not with the same timber, it would be a long time before there was real timber on that ridge again. But with green, the low persistent green of things that grow back from roots that survived, which is a different kind of green than the kind that was never burned, a harder and more certain kind. "Hey," Rowan said. She turned. He was behind her with his hands in his pockets and his good jacket from the wedding, which was Gerald's old jacket she'd taken in at the shoulders, which had fit him all right and would fit him better next season. "Hey," she said. He came to stand beside her and they looked at the ridge together. "We didn't get back what was taken," she said. It wasn't sad the way it sounded. It was just true. The 12 years, the letters, the life we would have had. "No," he said. "I used to think that was the thing," she said. "The thing I was trying to get back to. The point where it went wrong if I could just get back there and fix it." She paused. "But you can't fix a lie someone else told. You can only decide what to do with where you ended up." He looked at her. "We ended up here," she said. "Yeah," he said, "we did." She thought about all the things that had to go wrong for them to get here. Gerald's loan and his death and the drought and the fire and the wire holding a boot together and a little boy asleep on his father's shoulder. One lie told in a kitchen by a man who thought he was protecting something or controlling something, or maybe just couldn't bear what he didn't understand. And that lie had sent 2 people in different directions for 12 years. And those 12 years had broken things and built things. And what was built could not have existed without what was broken. She didn't forgive Walter Crane. She wasn't sure she ever would, completely. And she wasn't going to pretend otherwise. But she had stopped letting his decision be the thing that defined what came next. That was the best she could do with it, and it turned out the best she could do was enough. The windmill turned above the yard, steady and even. Rowan put his arm around her and she leaned into him, just slightly, not dramatically, just the small, uncalculated lean of a person who has decided to let something hold some of her weight. Years later, when Finn was grown, a broad-shouldered young man with his father's stillness and his own particular brand of considered attention to things. He would say that he had no memory of his life before the Mercer Ranch. Not because the before hadn't happened, but because the before was what happened to someone who didn't yet have a place to be from, and now he did. He would say this matter-of-factly, without sentiment, because that was how he said things. He would say it to his own children, eventually, on a ranch that was the Mercer Ranch, but different, bigger, improved in some places, weathered in others, marked by all the years of use and the particular decisions of the people who had worked it. The tin horse sat on the mantelpiece shelf by then, next to the silver piece. Next to the photograph, Evelyn and Gerald squinting into the sun on a day that seemed very long ago, and next to a newer photograph taken the spring after the wedding, the 3 of them on the front step in the May light, Finn between his parents with both horses in his hands, looking at the camera with an expression of absolute settled certainty, as if he had never doubted for a moment that this was where he was supposed to be. Maybe he hadn't. Children decide these things differently than adults do. They don't need everything explained, they just need the thing to be true, and this was true, and he had known it from the morning he put the tin horse down in front of a woman in a kitchen and waited to see what she would do with it. She had held it, she had given it back. That was enough for him. It turned out it was enough for all of them. Not the grand repayment of what had been stolen, not the restoration of the 12 years, not any of the things that anger and grief ask for and never receive. Just the daily, imperfect, genuine work of people who had decided to stay. who had decided that what was here, right now, was worth the staying. The windmill turned, the seasons came and went. The ridge above the north pasture grew back slow and green, and the Mercer Ranch, which had come so close to so many different kinds of ending, went on.